You probably realise from my accent that I work at a British university, but you may not be aware that coming soon there is a referendum, that's a national vote, about whether the United Kingdom should remain as a member of the European Union. This is a union of 28 countries throughout Europe. This is a subject in which many people have very strong views. Many organisations have not expressed an opinion whether you should vote yes to stay in or no to leave the union. However, I know exactly how my boss thinks, the head of my chemistry department, because he and 20 odd other heads of department wrote a letter to the newspaper to say that they believed that from the point of view of chemistry, people should vote yes to stay in the European Union. I feel that since the head of department has expressed a view, there's no reason why I shouldn't either. Now, before I explain my position, I should say that there is a lot of argument and passion being spent on this referendum. So really, I should talk about the point of view of science. And being members of the European Union has been very positive for most scientists in the UK. And there are several reasons. The first reason, which is perhaps, if you like, slightly selfish, is that the European Union has provided a lot of funding for scientific research in the UK. And my research group has benefited from this funding as well. Now, you could argue that this money could have come from the British government as well. However, the other benefits are more difficult to be produced by the UK government. Most of this European funding comes through collaborative projects where scientists in different countries of the European Union are working together, all of them trying to solve the same problem in partnership. I have been a member of several projects. One of them has just finished. This collaboration with EU scientists also leads to friendship. You get really quite close friendship scientifically with these people, and because they're trained in different countries, they think about a problem in a slightly different way. So when we put all our minds together, we often come up with solutions which individually we wouldn't.
You're friends with scientists from Asia, from the United States. You collaborate with those people. They're not in the European Union, but you don't have to be in the European Union for you, a British scientist, to collaborate with people.
I think that these collaborations are possible, obviously, with other countries, but they tend to be bilateral. You collaborate with somebody in China or you collaborate with somebody in America. It's much more difficult for the funding schemes that we have for those countries to assemble a multi-partner collaboration, perhaps with scientists in 2 or 3 countries and perhaps somebody in industry as well. The mechanisms don't really exist for that. The other thing which has been really important in the last few years has been the movement of scientists from one country to another. I have colleagues working here in the department who come from other European Union countries, academic colleagues. In my research group, I have people from all over the European Union, and British people have gone to work in Germany, to France, and this has produced a really wonderful flowering of chemistry and science. I would be extraordinarily sad if that opportunity went away.
Are you seriously suggesting that if the UK left the EU, that a really smart, talented scientist would not be allowed to come and work at the University of Nottingham?
I'm sure it wouldn't stop completely. However, it will become much harder. At the moment, it's much easier for us to employ somebody from the European Union. For other countries, it is much harder. We have to make a very well-argued case why we need somebody from America or even Australia, where you come from. It is something which will just put up barriers, which will probably encourage the people from those countries to go off and work somewhere else.
This is another argument being used by the people who think that the UK should leave, and it applies to what you said about science. Shouldn't British people and British authorities and British funding authorities decide how British funding is spent on science?
Well, that's a perfectly reasonable question, but it doesn't really apply to the funding of science, because at the moment, the funding of science in the UK is governed by something that is called the Haldane Principle, which means that the government gives money generally for, say, physical sciences, and then the scientists themselves decide how that money should be distributed. The problem comes that if we leave the European Union, British scientists will no longer be involved with the distribution of money from the European Union. And it will be much more difficult for us to participate in European projects. I have acquaintances in Norway and Switzerland, both of which are outside the European Union, who find it more difficult to participate in European projects than I do.
Do you know any British scientists who want to leave?
I personally have not met any scientists who want to leave. There are a few that I've read about in the newspapers, and as far as I can see, they are people working in quite niche areas of research who have run foul of some European legislation which affects biological experiments or whatever. The problem is that if we leave the EU, we would still probably be governed by some of these regulations, but we will have no control about how these regulations are made.
If the UK was to leave the European Union, how do you see science changing over the next 10, 20 years?
I'm extremely worried because I think it may mean that UK science gets substantially sidelined, that at the moment the UK is one of the strongest countries scientifically in the world. A high proportion of the most highly cited papers in the world come from the UK. I believe that that position is really quite strongly threatened if we leave the European Union.
But Professor, in the days before the European Union, that's some of British scientists' glory days. Some of the greatest British scientists were winning prizes and changing the world before the European Union. So why do you need the European Union to be a great science country?
That, in a way, is one way of looking at it. You can look at it from a completely different point of view, that the early part of the 20th century was racked by the two most terrible wars that have ever happened in the history of humanity. And although that drove all sorts of scientific developments, it was at a terrible human cost. And the great post-war advantage has been that Europe and the United States have experienced an unprecedented period of peace. Of course, there have been wars, terrible wars, in isolated countries, but no global conflict in the way that really affected my parents' lives, my grandparents' lives. Working together with countries is one way of ensuring that together we will work peacefully.
It's just a very useful tool for getting particular kinds of science done. And in particular, science is becoming a bigger and bigger business, right? That actually a lot of the things we do need large collaborations of groups of people, and you really need to kind of bring in the best skills from wherever you can get them.